So welcome today to our service dog handler chat on setting criteria. I picked this one because it's been kind of a reoccurring struggle, not even in just clients I see and people that I work with, but for myself as well. Because sometimes we think, we have a clear picture of the behavior we're asking our dog to do, but then sometimes we really don't. So if you're teaching a behavior like sit, most of us would agree that our dog's butt on the ground is a sit. Now, some people specifically with breeds like boxers might do an adjusted sit where it's slightly off the ground, but still close to the ground, But the general behavior of sit is the same. So we understand when we get a new puppy and we're setting the criteria for teaching sit, it's a simple behavior and we know what we want, so we don't really need a plan for that. But then when we start thinking of more complex behaviors, and whether you're going down the trick line, like the play dead, or I call it the take a nap cue, which is a 4-step process, or the service dog line of I need you to settle on this mat in a heel position or go under my chair or whatever it is. There's things that are more complicated. And those are the ones where we really need to, at least in our heads, but it helps on paper to define what our end behavior is. So focus on what it is you really want the dog to learn, because that can help you set your criteria for training it. You need the criteria of the end behavior first. We're all familiar with like back chaining our training sessions, but sometimes that can be a struggle. We might have that ideal end behavior goal, and then as we're going, we see subtle things that maybe make us rethink that criteria. For example, going with the sit, Azul has a very, very, very fuzzy butt, hence one of his nicknames. But so sitting is actually very hard for him when we're out in public because the floors are slippery. So when he was younger, when I asked him to sit, he would often offer a sit at home, but offer a down anywhere else. And because I'm so hesitant to actually cue a down in public with a young puppy, I just accepted that as okay, because working with other teams, I didn't want them to see me cueing a zoo into a down all the time when their puppy wasn't confident enough to lay down, and that can add more stress if we ask a dog that's a little bit stressed to lay down near something that's potentially triggering them. So I would always cue a sit, and if he chose to sit and go into a down, fine. That was acceptable criteria for me. Now he's older, and I don't normally ever cue a sit or a down in public because he just knows the environments where he wants to do it more so. And if I tell him to wait, or if he knows he's in a heel and I'm stopped in like the line at the pharmacy, he knows he's always okay to get in a down in that situation because we're probably going to be there a while. We might move a few feet, but he's going to lay right back down. So kind of trying to put in mind the behaviors you want long-term, along with the simple behavior, along with what your dog's breed abilities are. If you have a German Shepherd or a large breed, they can be prone to hip dysplasia. You don't want to ask them to sit all the time. But if you have a dog that is like built for rapid movements, you can do the whole sit, down, turn around, spin, all of those kind of repetitive behaviors because the dog is built for that high speed, high energy. Like Cindy's poodle Nick with high speed, or Aussies tend to be high speed. So, if you have a breed built for that, you can kind of build that into your criteria for the end goal of your sit behavior. Then you also have to kind of look at the individual's needs as far as, what they enjoy doing. So if a dog really, really struggles with the sit behavior because they're too overexcited in that situation, that's an individual need you have to figure out as to, is sit really the best behavior for this particular situation? Can I change it to an alternate behavior so that I don't spoil his sit cue because now he's wanting to ignore it or not stay when I ask him to sit because he's too excited? So other things like that, all of those kind of involve selecting your criteria wisely, which might have been a better topic title, but that was kind of too long and I wanted to keep it short. So yeah, so the whole idea of this discussion is selecting that criteria wisely based on more than just what do I want him to do today? What is my end goal? And then working back to what do I need him to do today? So I wanted to kind of discuss some common behaviors that people do differently. And just like the top one that comes to mind is leash manners, because everybody's got a different opinion of leash manners and leash skills. So that is one of those that, like, really you have to think of your end goal leash behavior as far as, if in a perfect world, what would your dog be doing in this environment? How would that differ from that environment? Would it be exactly the same kind of thing? And so that is a really, really common behavior that handlers do differently. So if we want to take just a moment to kind of describe our ideal leash manners behaviors, which, I mean, most of you, if you've taken any of my classes, the Crazy Teen class, the current Service Dog Foundations class, Competent Canines class, I describe mine quite regularly. And basically it's, if we're out and about in whether I'm on my dirt road nearby my house that has no one around, or on a trail walk where there's few people around, I basically just, my only criteria is I don't want to be pulled. You can sniff where you want, where the leash allows, just don't pull me. And then we have the exception of when somebody's walking our direction or there's a distraction that pops up in the environment, we'll heel temporarily and then be released to go sniff again, which means he can go basically wherever he wants within the leash length that I've chosen for that environment. So on my normal trail walking environment, that's normally an 8 to 10 foot leash. If I'm out in the middle of a field or, you know, middle of nowhere where I don't expect people, that might be a 20 to 50 foot long line. And if I'm in a trail, like even if I'm on a trail that's not visited frequently, but I have 3 or 4 other teams walking with me, then he's usually on a 4 foot or less leash because of the higher excitement around other dogs. So that's how I solve my end behavior for leash manners, is the leash predicts the behavior I want in the environment we're going into. And then of course, going into public, being a service dog, he also has the loose heel position with a shorter traffic lead whenever we are in a public space. So if you want to pop your hands up, if you want to describe your basic leash behavior, your end goal kind of thing. Well, and I figured Cindy would be first, so we will kind of let Cindy go off, and everyone else, if you want to discuss that, pop your hand up and we'll go in the order that hands show up. Go ahead, Cindy.
Okay, so I'm a little bit different than Penny in terms of where I can just let Nick kind of be a dog 100% without thinking, because I really don't have a good area for that. But I do have areas where we can do sniffy walks on a longer lead. And I usually combine his early morning walk with some sniffy walks and some training. So I use something that a lot of people cringe at. I use a retractable leash on those walks, which is 15 feet, and it gives, he knows that if it's locked in place, and he gets as much leash as I give him at the time, and he's not to pull on it. It's not, he doesn't get to freely go where he wants to go. When it's time for him to go sniff, I'll release him with an okay go cue, or to go find his potty spot, and he gets an okay go cue, which means, you know, you get the length of the leash, you can take it out. I just watch, because there's where he goes, there's traffic, so I have to watch. And then I can also use that for some recall training for his formal recall. I don't use that particular leash when we go walking on the trail near my house, because it's heavily trafficked, and I really need him on a shorter leash and in a casual, either, you know, a little bit in front of me, maybe. I posted a video in my group and on my Insta account with him sniffing yesterday, and it was just a short piece of him just kind of sniffing on a bridge, and he was on a 6-foot leash, and he had enough room, he had more than enough room to sniff. It just, because we were going to the park where the trail is, we needed to keep it on the shorter leash so we weren't interfering with other people. If I was hiking in the Sierras where or a couple places where he'd be allowed to be off leash, I just wouldn't have, depending on how his status of his recall would be, I would either have him off leash or on a long line where I could keep a control over him, you know, be able to grab him quickly. We don't do that too often, just because we haven't done it recently. When we're casually in stores doing service dog work, he needs to be at my side in heel position, but he's more relaxed. He doesn't have to be staring up at me. He doesn't have to, he can look around and see what's going on in the world. And then we have a formal heel, which we use for competitions, where he's in heel position and he's giving me eye contact, and he gets heavily rewarded for this position. So it's kind of becoming a default position, which is not the end of the world, because when we're out doing service dog work, it's nice to have him paying attention to me, but he also knows he's not going to get in trouble for looking around and wondering what's going on in the world. So I have a little bit different criteria than Penny. I do change things based partially on gear and partially on environment, because obviously if we're in the show ring at a show, or trial, he's going to know the difference between that and walking through Walmart and walking on a trail. So it's just a matter of, you know, gear and leashes, and the heel cue is only used when we're either practicing a formal heel or we're competing. The rest of the time, I use the different cues to tell him what position to be in, if there's a cue used at all. Okay, Elliot.
Sorry, I'm on my phone, so it's a little more awkward for the controls. So Zappo, I almost never actually have off leash unless we're in a fenced in area, and it's actually not even due to recall. He's a small dog, and there's a lot of coyotes, as well as really big hawks and eagles out where I live. And I have been out at a plant nursery, and there has been a hawk that has followed us that entire time at the plant nursery. So he's never off leash, just for safety reasons where I live, because I do not need him getting preyed upon. Similar to Cindy, I ask for a relaxed heel where he's not doing constant eye contact. I reinforce for heavy check-ins, but also he's allowed to look around, you know, take stock of the environment and keep going, but he's encouraged to check in and see if, monitor me for alerts and responses as needed. He does get long line time. Depending on the environment, I will let him out on up to about 50 feet of a long line. And I've got it marked so that I can reduce the length of the line as needed so that he can have a pretty decent sniffari or what have you. But most of the time I'm in pretty urban areas. And so he spends a lot of his time in a relaxed heel or on an 8-foot hands-free leash that I can have him just leashed for a comfortable heel at my side or undo for longer more relaxed sniffy walking if we're in like a park or, a nice area that's got lots of greenery for him to sniff as we walk along the road or whatever. But outside of that, most of his leashes are pretty relaxed heel with frequent check-ins.
So I would dare say that Cindy and Elliot's criteria and rules follow mine really closely, with the big difference being you guys are in more urban environments more often than I am, and I'm in more rural environments more often.
Correct.
So
And I
have the same rules for the same environments. We just are in different environments more frequently.
Yeah, I was going to say, I bring Zoppo into work with me, and work is often inside. And so because it's inside in an office environment, he is expected to be in a tighter heel than I have him if I'm, say, out on the road. But he knows to kind of heel automatically based on the amount of people. He's been reinforced for automatic, really close shoulder pressed to my leg heels in crowds. And, so he knows to adapt based upon the environment as well because of rates of reinforcement.
People is really my biggest determination when it comes to leash manners that I want. The occasional person more relaxed. Now I don't even have to ask Azul to heel when a person is walking near. I can just remind him he needs to stay on his side of the trail, and he can still be out in front of me, but it's taken us a long time to get there. And with some dogs, I've never gotten there. But Azul gets it. He wants to keep sniffing. The sniffing is more important than socializing with the people. So he will gladly stay out in front and sniff. But the more likelihood of people, and when he is on his 8 to 10 foot leash on a public trail, I always have the ability to shorten that real quickly to a 4 to 5 foot leash by using his front clip or clipping it twice to the back of his harness if we all of a sudden have more people on the trail or more dogs on the trail than I anticipated. So yeah, I'd say our criteria are pretty close to the same. We just are in different environments. So I did just type a message in the chat about type your other common behaviors that you notice lots of handlers do differently, or if you know there's a behavior that you do differently than most handlers, type just the name of that behavior in the chat so that we can discuss that particular behavior. But a couple of them that I know are somewhat important to me and that I kind of do a little bit differently, and also was something that I needed to think about before deciding on the leash manners I taught, was the need for the forward momentum task. So because I needed Azul to learn to do that light kind of pull, I did the same thing with Cindy as a retractable. We use retractables very sparingly, but when Azul was a puppy, and quite honestly, with my last several puppies, we've used retractable for leash walks because they learn the strength of pull that's allowed and tolerated. So unless I ask Azul to go, which is his cue to step into it for the forward momentum, he knows he's not supposed to put any more tension on that leash than what you would do with a retractable that's not pulled out to the end. So if I stop the retractable at whatever distance he's at, he knows not to pull any harder because that would be more force than what it would be if the retractable was moving on its own. So I use that early on with the puppy to get that generalized so that when I start to teach my forward momentum, I want them to understand a little bit of pull is okay, but now I'm just like increasing that criteria slightly to add a little bit more pull. So instead of trying to teach the dog not to pull at that age, which I mean, still when I taught Azul forward momentum, we did have some struggles with pulling too hard around distractions. But the whole idea was because he knew it a little bit, I could teach him more when it was acceptable to pull and at what strength he was again starting to pull too hard because he was already used to that retractable tension. So I use that to build up the behavior for the forward momentum pull. And I actually teach that first off, going up hills where dogs are more likely to lean into the pull anyways. And handlers, even if they're having a good day, if they ever need forward momentum pull, it's usually going up hills first. So I kind of looked at my end goal behavior of forward momentum pull and then back chained it to figure out which environments and which tools I needed to use for that. And so my only other thing that I do a little bit differently with the forward momentum pull than I see a lot of handlers do is I only use a soft handle. And that's basically a personal choice for me because I know that if I have something in my hands, so I'm a leaner personally. If there's a table there I can lean on, I'm leaning on it. If there's a chair I can lean on, I'm leaning on it, a counter, whatever. I very rarely stand without leaning. And so knowing that about me, if I had a hard handle on my dog when I was walking him, I would be more prone to lean on that. And I don't want to do that. So, and especially with Zul, he's a little bit smaller than probably the ideal height for mobility tasks with me. The soft handle allows me to get that height I need without worrying about pushing down on him and creating that. So before I open it up to see if anyone else has other tricks for forward mobility, Ashlyn says that she uses a 26-foot retractable leash, but she looks at different lengths when in public, or so she basically uses that different length in public. When she wants her dog to walk by her chair, it's usually within 3 or 4 feet. So before we go on to the next behavior, does anybody have any tips or tricks for forward momentum pull? Or criteria they use as to when they use it or how they taught their dog their criteria? And I'm not seeing any hands go up. So we can move on to the next behavior that is in the chat. Okay, Cindy, I see your hand go up. Go ahead.
I was just wanted to mention that, so I started teaching Nick forward momentum pull last fall, and it was going really well and he really liked it. And I still use it a little bit, not much. But if you have any lower back issues, you're going to find out you have lower back issues from a momentum pull, even if it's just a slight pull, because your hand is out. You're pulling on one side of your body or the other just a little bit more. So that's just something to be aware of if you are thinking about a forward momentum pull. And Nick is also on the smaller side, but again, I use a soft handle. I don't use it very often. It's mostly if I'm following my boyfriend and he's walking faster than I'm able to keep up with for some reason. Then I'll use the forward momentum pull and just a little bit. It's just a very light pressure. Usually it's more, I need to hold onto the handle to make the world stop spinning. And it's just a matter of, I'm not, my vision is such that it's difficult to explain, but it's a visual issue. And by putting my hand on something, it's grounding. And so having that handle to hold on to makes a big difference. And it's not about that, because this is not about momentum or pulling. It's about, and it's not about pulling on the dog. It's about actually having the piece of equipment that in my hand that the dog's that's attached to the dog. I don't even know if I'm explaining
It's
this.
that tactile feel.
It's that
You can
tactile-
tell, so you're not pulling on the dog if you tip. You can
No,
you're tipping because of the way the handle adjusts in your hands.
exactly.
Totally understand that one.
Yes, obviously you do, because you explained it.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I use that one a lot, and like kind of at any given moment, I could just tip slightly in either direction.
Well,
Because
that's
it doesn't pay any attention to that. Now,
I
if I
was-
tip enough that I'm starting to take him, not really off his feet, that's the wrong terminology, but taking him, you know, slightly further to the side, when he can actually feel that, he will then set himself, you know, like all fours and kind of lean the opposite direction.
Mhm.
Now, he also knows that if he's having to do that too frequently, I'm pushing myself too hard. And so that's when he will stop me from walking forward by doing his paw target onto my foot target. Because you really can't walk forward when a dog's standing in front of you and stepping on you.
No,
So,
no,
but yeah, that's a big one too, that counterbalance. I don't need the full, I'm totally falling, but that grounding feel of that handle in my hand.
and it
Elliot-
also kind of cues the dog, because they can feel it. It can cue them to lean into you a little bit more as well. But it's not something where you want the dog necessarily feeling a lot of tension on their body. It's to communicate with them, hey, I'm, you know, feeling a bit spacey, essentially. And Nick knows when when I don't have the harness on him, when I'm feeling spacey, and he lets me know in other ways. But it looks like Elliot has something to say now.
I just wanted to say that obviously Zappa is way too small for mobility work in that sense, but I found, at least for myself, while I use a hands-free leash, sometimes I just reach and grab the leash, and that helps with my sense of proprioception. And it's not really grounding so much as, and grounding is a close word, but it's really more of a reorienting myself in my space and my bodily awareness.
That's a
And
better definition, the reorienting.
yeah, it's really mostly a
Better
reorienting of
reorient
myself.
where I am in my environment.
Yeah, and I use that even with Zappo, even as small as he is, just to feel that leash, feel the tension or lack thereof. And suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm right here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very helpful, even though it's not really a trained task. It's a way that I've used loose leash walking in a task sort of sense.
And now we'll all be on the service dog community blacklist for doing mobility on dogs that are too small.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean,
Don't
Zappa
worry.
loves to be a little guide dog, and I just follow him. I don't use that. I don't use any weight. I don't use leash pressure. He's just walking in front of me and
I
shows me
did
how to get to the
recently
car.
see a post about a small dog being used for a guide for that same kind of similar purpose of, you know, she would tell the dog when she needed to be, say, taken out the door to the car kind of thing. So she could physically see where she was going. But
Exactly.
mentally, sometimes we just get fatigued to the point that that can be a challenge. And Azul is taught to go find the car. And I can say that from pretty much anywhere in a store, maybe not in an outdoor environment because he never wants to go find the car in an outdoor environment. But when I'm really bad, he will, when it's not a practice thing. But having that ability to just follow the dog helps you to block everything else out that might be a distraction in your environment. So it's not that the dog is actually leading you to that or, you know, pulling you toward that. It's that you're now focused on the dog and the dog knows where you're headed. So they're basically guiding you in a non-weight bearing way.
Exactly. And that's like, he's not pulling weight. He's not tugging. There's no pressure on his body or his trachea or anything. And he'll look back at me as we're going, like, are you following me? Yes, you're still following me. Good. Let's keep going. And it's still that same level of check in, except he's now in front of me to make sure I'm remembering how to get back to something. But it's
Found
never
that
very careful
when
to
I'm
not
doing those forward mobility or you know, the go find daddy or go follow a person or something like that, Azul can do those pretty much without any cue. Like all I have to do is mention daddy and boom, he's, you know, on it. But I find myself repeating that cue because otherwise it can look like he's pulling me out of the store uncontrollably kind of thing, you know? Because depending on how bad I am at the moment depends on how hard he is actually pulling. And he does have a cue for slow down or, you know, relax it a little bit if he's going too fast. But, you know, otherwise he looks like a totally untrained dog pulling me around. So I frequently repeat, yep, go find daddy. Or, yep, we're following daddy. Keep it up. Keep going. Go find daddy. Kind of thing, just so that people around can kind of realize, oh, she wants him to do that and not look at me like, oh man, that's an untrained dog.
I do
Because
the
I
same.
easily let go of the handle and he automatically pops right back into the heel the second my hand comes off the handle, because he's checking in with me and making sure that I'm not like literally falling over. So that's something that I didn't do intentionally, but I noticed that I'm doing it. Go ahead, Elliot.
I was gonna say I do the same thing with Zoppo. If I need that help finding the way out of somewhere, I was like, yeah, show me the way out, show me the way out. That way people know he is in, you know, he's doing something at that moment. And that's why he's out in front. Because I'm like, no, he's really under control and I swear he's doing something. He's not just doing this for, you know, as part of being disobedient or the like.
Right. Ashlyn said kind of the same thing where she thinks some people would think Lily is too small, but they don't realize, you know, she is a very small person. So when you look at size, it's got to be handler size and dog size. And Azul definitely is too short, but he's a 70-pound husky. So he was bred for pulling. So that little bit of forward momentum pull that he does is totally in his, and it's something he loves to do. It's probably his most favorite task to do. Unless he wants to stop and sniff along the way, it's definitely his favorite task. So that goes back to the breed abilities and what is your breed designed for. Cindy, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not just when you're looking at mobility issues, it's not just how the ratio of the dog to the handler, it's also how much is the handler able to manage themselves, you know, whereas Ashlyn probably has a little less mobility than I do. So she definitely needs a dog that's appropriate to her height and weight. I can get away with doing, you know, having Nick tell me where I am in spatial orientation, and without putting much pressure on him, and use him for other tasks that allow me to maintain that spatial orientation a little bit better. And that needs to be considered when you're looking at a service dog as well. I wouldn't do well with a small service dog like Zoppo, because I need the height, I need the legs, but I don't necessarily need the bulk of a lab, because I'm not necessarily doing the same types of things as Ashlyn's doing. So, you know, there's a lot of criteria when you're considering whether you're going to do a momentum pull.
Well, I think that
Another great thing that we probably should have talked about in the very beginning is thinking about the criteria for the behaviors you want down the road before you choose the breed that you get. That's another good area where you really got to think about the criteria first. So moving on, and I know this one in the example is one that we very commonly all do a little bit differently. And I know some of that is also based on environment, like the leash manners. So moving on, our next one is the tuck behavior. And Cindy, since you put that in the chat, do you want to go ahead and explain your criteria for a tuck behavior?
Sure. So it depends on what's going on. So after having a giant dog, a Great Pyrenees, as a service dog, and realizing that some places it's actually it's impossible to have her tuck under the table, I went with a dog that's half her size and can tuck under a chair. And what I have found is there's two ways you can have your dog tuck under the chair. And if you're sitting up against the wall, it's easiest to have them either tuck directly under the chair and just kind of go perpendicular to you. But a lot of time, most of the time, I will have Nick sit directly under the chair and going the same direction as I am. So so my hands are here, his paws would be directly beneath where my hands are. So he's going forward. And that's helpful for him because he can fit under most chairs in most restaurants and businesses, that he can sit that way because tables are different. Like I was at lunch with a group of friends. There were 5 of us there and 4 of us had service dogs, and 3 of them were labs and 1 was Nick. And the table had the braces so that they were in an X pattern underneath the table, so that the braces went out to the corners of the table, which is difficult it made it very difficult for the labs to tuck, because part of it was they were all puppies, and one of them was old, it was about a year, and wasn't quite sure, didn't know how to tuck underneath the chair the way Nick was tucked. I had Nick tucked under the chair, and it gave the puppies more room. But they still, I've had enough encounters where I've either had the harness get hooked or the dog not fit under the table, that I wanted as many options as possible. In doctor's offices, I often put Nick, underneath the chair going the other direction perpendicular, or if I'm sitting on a bench, I'll have him sit between the bench legs and my legs perpendicular. But because I like him tucked under, so I know where he's at. The other thing I have him do is I have him sit between my knees in a sit, and I tend to do this mostly in when I'm sitting in class for one of my dog training classes, because then I can have him, I know where he's at. I know he's not interacting with other dogs. I know he's not trying to interact with other dogs. He's right there. If he chooses to lay down underneath me, that's fine, but he can sit up and watch also. Penny, do you want to?
Yeah, that's an actual really, really good one. And like you said, it does kind of depend on environment. And for me, a big one is other dogs and what are their skill sets. So like you, Azul is taught to be tucked totally under my chair the same way. He's a little bit longer than Nick is, so he sticks out a little bit further. My goal is to be able to look behind me, and I might see part of his tail, but other than that, I don't really want to see anything behind my chair. Or if my chair is against the wall, then his butt up against the wall. So he's basically touching the wall, at least with his tail. So that puts him sticking out a little bit further in front. His paws might be an inch or so in front of my feet, but not really far. And that usually puts his head either right in between my feet when he lays it down on the floor, or he might spin it just slightly. So he's doing a chin rest on a foot, which is what he likes to do when he's going to take a deep nap while we're there. But he very rarely gets in that position, again, because I'm in that more rural environment and we tend to take social distancing really, really extremely here. We did it long before COVID, that we usually have more seats in a waiting room than what we have people. We usually have people that just generally give more space. So if I can pick a corner chair in the corner of a waiting room, or like between my chair in a doctor's office and the bed, or something like that, where I don't have to make him get into that smaller tuck under my chair and he can stretch out, he's definitely much more comfortable in that position. So because I don't do public transportation, for one, because we don't have it around us, but for two, airplane travel is just not something I do regularly either. He's never had to be in that tight tuck position for more than, say, a half an hour, which would be enough if we were going to ride a bus across town in a bigger town kind of thing. He could hold it, but I very rarely ask him to do so. I do want to get some videos of that smaller tuck, kind of like I have some of him getting in and out of position, but I want to just kind of do some teaching videos on that. So you can watch for that in the near future, or you can share your videos with how small can your dog get kind of thing. But the whole idea of the behavior of tuck is going to be based on my surroundings. So the other day I went with a team to a restaurant, and it was the other dog's first exposure to a restaurant. And ideally Azul jumps right under the table, and the other dog was a Great Dane, so it was huge. And so the handler tried to position her behind the row of chairs, because I mean, we purposely picked a table where we didn't have, where it was not a high chance that somebody would sit behind us. And there were a lot of other tables around. So that would allow a dog to be behind the row of chairs on either side of us without really being in anybody's way. For the slow time of day, we picked the restaurant and everything. Well, since Azul went immediately under the table, she positioned her dog behind her chairs. And Azul quickly realized that her dog was struggling with settle because she felt too exposed. So Azul shifted his position from under the table to go back behind my chair and go under the chair, so that he was in the position Cindy was just describing, with his head between my feet, which allowed the other dog to fit under the table and still give us space, but from dog nose to dog nose. So he recognized that long before I did. Of course, I was distracted with food and whatnot, but he could see the other dog's discomfort and adjusted himself to allow the dog for more space, because she wanted under the table. And once he moved, she could get under the table and settle and relax, and actually went to sleep. So it is kind of a matter of who you're with and the environment you're in and how busy that restaurant is, as far as what your requirements are for tucking. And so Ashlyn did make a comment, and I was going to get to it. I saw it this time, that because she is in a chair, it's almost impossible for a dog to go under. So she teaches her dog to lay down beside her chair, which is another question we had from our Service Dog Foundations class recently, is should I keep working on under if I use a power chair when I'm out and about most of the time? And so when we refer to it as under versus tuck, and I know, I mean, that's the cue I use with Azul, is I tell him under, but under means go under whatever is around. So that could be my chair, that could be a table, that could be my legs. It could be anything. It could be under a tree. But so under is just a general go under whatever I'm pointing to, or, you know, what makes the most amount of sense in this environment. And so while I use the cue under, really calling it a tuck just kind of helps separate it in the minds of people that may be trying to figure out how to set up the behavior to fit their particular situation. Because like Ashlyn said, if you're in a chair, you might not do it under your legs, but you're doing it tucked down beside you, or it might be out in front of you under the table at your feet. Or if you walk with a walker, I have a client that pushes a walker most of the time when he's out in public. And because of that, he gets an extreme fatigue where his knee will buckle. And so his dog is trained to, whenever he sits in public, to go under his chair, his walker. When, after the guy sits down, he waits for the handler to sit down, and then the dog automatically goes under the walker and tucks, unless he's given a cue to do something else, which I thought was a great way of making sure they're both safe. Having that auto kind of behavior installed keeps them both safe. He knows if his dog is uncomfortable in the environment, because he knows that his dog would normally go under the walker if he was comfortable. So if he's not, there must be a distraction around. And Ashlyn does the same thing. And I've seen pictures of baby Daisy, her puppy, under the walker, and that are so cute. She does teach her dogs to go under the walker as well, or under her standard wheelchair, not her power chair. So, and then Elliot also says she teaches Zappo to go under her legs or behind her feet if she can't have him under the table. Which, so there are a lot of great ways to do it. And that's kind of one of my biggest things to service dog clients. Just because you see one thing on social media of a way another handler does it, doesn't mean that has to work for your dog. You can try it. You can see if it works for your team. But if it doesn't, tweak it so that it works for your team, because there's no specific rule that says your dog has to heel on the left side or the right side, or in this position, or your dog has to tuck this specific way. And those are the kind of things, like your dog has to be under control and has to be following your lead. But as a team, you have to work out those end behaviors that are going to be best for you, and that will help you build that criteria for training that. So I just know that, I know we're getting kind of close to our hour, but I know that for me, it has really helped having, in the training of the second service dog versus the first service dog. Because when you're training your first service dog, you're very much into watching what you see other people do, and then trying to conform your dog to fit those standards, which I totally understand. I did it myself, so I get that. And that's why I always try to help my clients that are working through that first dog situation to really think about what is best for that dog and for the handler in a given environment, and not compare yourself so much to other teams. So Patty, I know you joined late. My phone's going off. But I just wanted to see if you had a specific behavior or a suggestion for setting criteria. We talked about the need for figuring out what your end behavior is before you start training, so that you can back chain your criteria. So we explained that. Do you have any other great tips about behaviors and setting up that criteria to get to your end behavior?
Yeah, I pay attention to my service dog all the time, because I use their body language as a signal to me. Like if someone's approaching me from behind or someone's coming from the front, etc. Because mine watch around me to alert me. Because if someone comes up behind me, they're going to get smacked. Just a reflex I have because of my PTSD. So my dog alerts me by climbing on me or whining or, like that. So the dog did that. I didn't teach him that. And so I rewarded them, and it has benefited me. So, some things they do can actually turn out to help you more than you realize, is what I've learned. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they do things you don't even intend them to do, but it helps and benefits you. So in the long run, you learn that this helps you, so let's teach the next one that, and so forth. So it's kind of it's been a learning process for me from day one since I've had a service animal. You learn new things every day with each dog. Each one's different. Not one's the same. Different techniques work for this one, while these techniques work for this one. So they vary, if you know what I'm saying. That's what I've learned.
And that's a really good point too, that like sometimes our dogs have a way of figuring out what we need before we really realize that. And that's something that we talk about with our foundations class and our medical alert classes, is that the behaviors you want from your dog should affect you, not affect the other people in the environment. And you kind of just hit on that, Patty, very clearly with your dog lets you know when somebody's coming up behind you, as opposed to stopping that person from coming up behind you. That's not a written rule per se, but that's like my general guideline of, I never want my dog to do something that is telling somebody in public what to do. Unless maybe it's getting help from me, but even that's kind of really questionable. And I don't train my dogs to get help from me, except for my off-leash dog on our property knows that if I'm down and not talking to him, like, so I'm unresponsive, he's to go to the back door and bark because he's off leash and on property. He can do that, you know. But other than that, I don't teach my dogs to interact with other people as a way to communicate with them. Azul is very people friendly and loves to interact with the public as a reinforcement, but not as a communicating my needs kind of thing. So that's something we try to stress when anybody's looking at teaching tasks, is make sure your tasks involve you.
And I've also kind of taught my dogs to avoid people. And for them to step away from someone is also another signal someone's coming up to me. So I have one of those leashes I can put over my shoulder, and then I have a handle on it made by Roughwear. And so the leash is also kind of a signal thing for me as to what's going on around me. And I use it for that purpose. And so when my dog reacts, I know to look and see because I feel it from the leash. And so I've taught my dogs not to approach people. And if someone comes up to pet them, they step away backwards, take a couple steps back, or get behind me or in front of me. Or like if I have a cart, they'll get between me and the cart, out of the way of somebody coming down the aisle with another cart. You know, just little odds and ends I've taught them to do. One time I was talking to an off-duty policeman, and he was just wanting to learn more about service animals. So I was, answering questions, explaining what tasks they can do and stuff. And he noticed that Izzy was sitting next to me, but looking behind me and watching everything. And he noticed people would kind of go a little bit away because she was watching. But when someone came up to me, she stood on her hind legs, pawing at me to get my attention. And I turned around. The officer noticed that. He's like, "Do you have some kind of PTSD?" And I said, "Yes. If anyone approaches me from behind and I don't get alerted by my service animal, I have a reflex where I will hit them. And it's not done on purpose." And he's like, "Okay." So it kind of helped him learn more about someone with everyday PTSD instead of military PTSD. So in a way, a lot of the officers know me here because of what I've taught. One of them that was a cadet that I came and educated about service animals told me thank you for what I did. And that meant a lot to me to hear that from him. He even still has the little card saying what you can and cannot ask and so forth, and that he carries in his wallet that I gave them in the class,
My first service dog was a pro at evading people. Now I've noticed that if somebody is approaching more rapidly, and so with Azul, he is super friendly, but if they're approaching, like staring at him kind of thing, then he kind of just stops moving. And then like you, I feel that tension on the leash because he stopped moving and I didn't stop, it creates that tension and tells me somebody's moving up behind us. I don't have the whole
Izzy,
PTSD
when someone
issue.
does that, Izzy,
Yeah.
when someone does that to me, Izzy will just
Yeah.
like that, just a mild bark.
I don't have the whole PTSD issue. So that's enough for me to let me know someone's coming up. And then if somebody's not like overly paying attention to him, or, if they're doing the sheepish, like pretending not to look, but he knows they're still focused in on him, he will still stop. But if they're totally ignoring him, he doesn't care that anybody's walking up behind, and they can walk up and walk right past. So it's more of he reads the situation of what's going on behind me and decides, is that person going to distract us? If so, let's let mom know they're coming. So, but yeah, there are different ways to kind of develop those communication skills between our dogs and us. I think that's going to kind of wrap it up. I'm just going to turn it over to Elliot to see if there is anything else you wanted to add, because I know you had your hand raised for a little while, or if you want to wrap us up tonight or this afternoon since it's daytime.
I was just gonna, Patty touched a little bit on what I was gonna add, is that with letting your dog affect some of the criteria, and Zappo's kind of an obvious one with like, I don't have him sit a lot or lay down a lot on cold surfaces because he's hairless. So as a result, I often have him stand unless there's a good reason to have a settle, just a relaxed, calm stand. But then there are other things I've done with him where we've kind of shifted the criteria together as we figured out what works best, like shutting doors. There's a reason why I'm teaching him to use his butt to bump things shut, because that's a very natural behavior for him. He likes to use that as a target. It avoids getting his nails on things. It's more comfortable for him than nosing something. And so I've let his behaviors kind of turn that into, how do we turn this into a solution for us? So that was just one thing I wanted to bring up with criteria, is also, what is your dog most naturally inclined to do? Is it something that you can in turn use as behaviors together? Because if it's something your dog likes to do, that's a really happy dog you're about to make by using their loved behavior as a heavily rewarded task or cue. So that was kind of my last bit of criteria that I like to use for behaviors, is what does my dog want to do in this situation, and kind of build together.
And I love that. Like I had alluded earlier, the forward momentum pull being Azul's favorite task, we've really expanded that to have more ways for him to use that task than what my previous service dog did, just because he enjoys it so much. And I love the idea of Elliot closing doors with his butt. I've seen videos of your training, and that's something that Azul would absolutely hate. Like, he doesn't like closed doors. He'd rather everything be open all the time, even the door to outside. So he, of course, has no problem opening doors, but is not a huge fan of closing them unless he absolutely has to. So that's something that we haven't really worked on a whole heck of a lot. I've only trained him briefly to close doors just because he didn't enjoy it. And it's not something that I need. Opening doors is definitely more productive for him. And
Zappo needs it because he likes to open the door when I'm in the bathroom and leave the door wide open upon leaving. So he is being made to learn how to close the doors after he busts it wide open, because that needs to happen.
Of course, because he's a little dog, but still he can't fit through the door unless it's totally wide open, right? Yep, I can see that one. So unless anybody has anything else specific, we are just over our hour, so we will go ahead and end it there.